I'm Josh Johnson. He, him, his. I teach at the University of Minnesota Morris in the English program. I teach some literature, some academic writing, some creative writing, and I run our writing center. And I've got a book coming out. This is, I suppose, the more relevant part. I've got a book coming out in January 19th, called The Forever Sea, which is a, I don't know, there are all sorts of, kind of dumb descriptive terms about it, but it's a sort of eco-fabulist tale, or a kind of environmental fantasy that imagines the world as a kind of miles high prairie sea that boats sail on top of, and hijinks ensue. So that's me.
All right.
And I am Josh's colleague here at the University of Minnesota Morris as well. So, but I do biology. I don't write fiction. I don't think. Some people think it is, but yeah. So I write about biology, and I write about politics, and I write about religion. But I'm also a big fan of science fiction and fantasy, and I've read more than my share of apocalyptic novels. So that's all I can contribute to this, is Hey, I know what you guys are talking about. I've read stuff like that before.
Oh, you want me? Sure. I am hjhornbeck. I'm just a blogger on Free Thought blogs, and also I am an academic, just a PhD candidate in computer science, though. So I don't provide a lot here, other than because I'm sort of in Alberta, sort of, which is kind of perched on a really interesting spot when it comes to climate change because of tons of our parks and our proximity to prairie and desert and all that. I do kind of feel it in some ways, but I don't really provide any deep insight other than, well, this looks kind of weird, and oh, I read this once, in a newspaper. So, yeah,
Get the layman's perspective a little bit.
yeah.
And I'm Abe Drayton. I run the blog. I write the blog Oceanoxia, which started out 10 years ago this October as uh, specifically a blog about the worst case scenarios of climate change from a time when I was frustrated by the degree to which the scenarios that people were calling alarmist were, well, somewhat weak sauce, shall we say. What comes to mind is, as somebody I think on Fox News referring to 2 feet of sea level rise as alarmist at a point in time where I was realizing that it was not going to stop warming in my lifetime, and I could, we were looking at possibly hundreds of feet of sea level rise before it stopped rising. And so, I've increasingly, I guess, made my life's work about what's so scary about climate change, and have since tried to move a little bit more in the direction of how to sort of face that fear, accept that we are, as I like to say, we've transported ourselves to a different planet, and now we get to try to terraform it before it kills us, or at the very least develop habitation that is protected from this hostile, strange world that we and all the life that we used to hang out with have just been transported to. I was figuring this would be kind of a discussion, more than anything, just kind of a little bit of a free for all. I mean, there's a degree to which everybody knows what's scary about climate change, and so I want to talk a bit about the sort of the things that we know to be scared of and whatnot. But I think that in honor of the season and the coming spooky holiday, I also want to spend a fair amount of time looking at, in the grand tradition of horror movies being about, or horror stories, I guess, being as much about how people respond to horror as they are about the horrifying things themselves. So I want to talk a bit about how humans as individuals and as a species may end up responding to some of the coming changes. And I want to sort of delve into a little bit about sort of what might be kind of spooky about the changes that are happening and the ways in which they'll feel sort of unsettling as much as just kind of like existentially terrifying, and what the world's going to look like in the future, because I think it is going to be, if any of us were transported into the future, I suppose you could think of it in terms of like the first Planet of the Apes movie, where it would be sort of recognizable but also different in kind of disturbing ways. So I thought we could sort of go along those lines. Does that make sense to folks?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I can think of lots of, there's a lot of fiction out there that deals with the aftermath of environmental catastrophes, and a lot of exploration of what happens when that happens.
Well, and like, I know I've always enjoyed playing around with the atmosphere, like the series that I've been working on with, New York City as a kind of man-made archipelago of buildings, and things like scuba diving in the ancient subways of New York city in the deep future. And I like there's the sort of, I guess we can kind of, getting the sort of immediate thing like sea level rise. That's going to be freaky. That's going to be scary. It's going to be flooding. We're already seeing the sort of escalating droughts, heat waves, and accompanying fires. And there was a recent report indicating that within the next 50 years, even areas that are currently considered fairly sort of wet and safe, like, I don't know, my old stomping grounds in New England, may end up being also vulnerable to wildfires, which would, having that be a problem basically everywhere would be something new. And fire is scary. And then, of course, there's the problems with food access and crops.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, have either of you read, or any of you read J.G. Ballard's book, The Drowned World?
Oh,
I have not.
Yeah.
So it's older, like everything that he's written, but I think like a lot of older sci-fi, it has certain, sort of problems with kind of misogyny and certain kind of golden era sort of issues. But one of the interesting things that he does is he imagines a world with really rampant sea level rise, in which people are sort of fleeing to the poles because the sort of central band around the Earth is getting too warm, and water is continuing to rise. And one of the really sort of interesting things about that is like the sea level rise part. I teach that book, or I have taught it several times before, and students are not usually especially spooked or made uneasy by ideas of sea level rise, because I think they see it, they've seen those like depictions of this so often, and the idea of a kind of big ocean is a thing that they already know about. And so it feels like a kind of escalation of a thing that they've already seen. And I think so many people today have been kind of primed for, sort of doomsday apocalyptic scenarios. But the thing that was sort of most, I think, spooky to them, or sort of most unsettling, is this idea that like the world is no longer a big open space, that it's no longer a sort of kind of bounded infinity, that the kind of livable, arable places are, becoming fewer and fewer, in this notion that like the world is supposed to be my oyster, and now what you're telling me is I've got a really teeny oyster and it's getting smaller. And I think that more than anything is really spooky to them. And so these ideas of like, like when do we have a sort of Dust Bowl climate in Minnesota, right? At what point, do we start thinking like, well, 103 degrees in the summer is pretty normal for Calgary or something like that. Like that idea of sort of spaces being really compressed, I think is really unsettling for me, but I think also for a lot of the students that I teach.
Mhm.
I guess the worst case scenario that I initially focused on, that the title of my blog came from, is the possibility that as the seas warm, they will run out of oxygen. And if they run out of enough oxygen, pretty much every body of water has anoxic bacteria in it that sort of down in the muck, that produces hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. And one of the theories for the Permian Triassic extinction event, which did seem to take place in the ocean and then on land, this is also known as the Great Dying, was that the oceans, there was a big warming event, the oceans heated up, there was a massive die-off, there wasn't enough overturning, and they stagnated to a degree, and there was a buildup of hydrogen sulfide that then basically leaked out onto the land and gassed the low-lying areas of the planet with mine gas. Of course, we can't be certain that's what happened, but we do know that that kind of buildup is possible. There's a lake in New York called Green Lake in Fayetteville, New York. And if you dive down deep enough, the water starts to turn pink because it is just full of hydrogen sulfide. And it's sort of, there's just a dead layer there where nothing that cannot survive in that toxic stew exists. Those bacteria are everywhere in the world. So they're just there. They're just waiting. And if the conditions are right, well, life on Earth didn't used to run on oxygen, and it doesn't have to in the future. It's just that we happen to rely on it. So that's one doomsday scenario.
Yeah, oxygen is a much better electron acceptor, so it wouldn't be as efficient. And no, we do not want that future. Please stop it.
It's a cheery start to the discussion.
Tis the
Yeah.
season.
But now we've got nowhere to go but up, right?
Well, we'll see about that.
Well, so one thing I will do just to direct us in a more sort of traditionally Halloweeny thing was one of the changes that I had a series on for a while was the rise of slime, which is as oxygen decreases in the ocean, and as life becomes difficult for certain more complex forms of life, things that are slimy are actually going to have a bit of a boost. Things like jellyfish can do better in low oxygen areas, and tunicates for the ocean, large algal blooms that can sort of generate, to the degree they need oxygen, they can generate their own. I remember a while back there was like a, 10-mile long just string of slimy algae in the Chukchi Sea that was found, that sort of perplexed everybody and kind of weirded everybody out. And, things like funguses and molds will probably do pretty well. And so it may be that we are heading towards a slimier future. Not to mention that we may end up having to rely on algae and bacteria to feed the massive human population. So it might be like in The Matrix, where we get that sort of bowl of runny goop that hopefully we can flavor a little nicer to provide for our basic needs.
Or like Soylent Green.
Well, and that is a climate change story.
Yes, it is. And the rich continue to get their protein.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like the sort of subgenre of weird fiction, right? Capital W, weird fiction. So, people like China Miéville and Jeff Vandermeer and some of these people who are writing. And it seems like many of those stories, I don't know why I'm thinking about this, except your point about kind of slimy, sort of stuff. It seems to me that many of them are sort of envisioning futures in which the sort of slimy and toadstooly among us rise up, and what we typically think of as more kind of complex and complicated organisms kind of fall to the wayside, I think, a little bit. But I also, I think there are a lot of people. One of the things that I really like about sci-fi and fantasy and just sort of speculative fiction in general is the kind of bigger sort of systems thinking approach that many of these authors take in trying to sort of piece out world building and kind of extrapolation in these sorts of things. And so, we ask a kind of fundamental question about like, well, what changes if this occurs, right? So like Mary Robinette Kowal just published that trilogy of books, or I don't know if it's a finished trilogy, but 3 books about like what happens, I think, if a meteorite crushes most of DC and the Eastern Seaboard. And then, everything from that is a kind of logical extrapolation or ramification of that. And I think a lot of, I've seen a lot of authors thinking about these sort of like, well, what are we going to eat in a future where we don't have beef or pork or, much corn or much soy or whatever it is, right? And I think even as it's like kind of a scary future, I think there's also something kind of like sort of fun to think about, right? In some ways it feels a little bit like a video game where you're sort of like, it's sort of a fun problem solving exercise. and the potential downfall is just the ceasing of the existence of the human race. But yeah.
Although that Mary Robinette Kowal's books, I only read the first one because it kind of annoyed me, because it's primarily about how can we escape Earth.
Yeah, right.
And that's there are these two strains in science fiction where you get the cataclysmic disaster, and one strain is, oh, how can we escape to Mars or wherever, and never thinks about how that's so much more difficult than repairing a damaged planet. And then there's the other one that's adapt or die, or how do you accommodate yourself to these environments. I find that so much more interesting.
Well, so I think this is a point to shift the subject a little bit, to how humanity will become a source of fear for ourselves and each other. So I think that we're already seeing a divide between certain people, particularly among the capitalist class, who are seeking effectively to leave the planet. And it's the mix of things between people like Bezos and Musk, with their fantastical delusions of forming a colony on Mars, and their sort of, in my view, rather naive followers who think that that's like totally something that's going to happen in their lifetime. There's also the version, which honestly, there's a part of me that always wonders if someone like Elon Musk isn't like, he's putting some resources into the space program for show, but mainly what he's doing is building bunkers, and just not telling us, so to speak. Ditto with like this hyperloop project of his. It's in my more paranoid moments. But there have been some articles floating around of people writing after having been called in to consult with rich people about what the future is going to be like, because most of them, for all they're unwilling to make the changes that would be necessary to make a better world, do see where things are going, and some of them are not stupid, and there are plans for fortress compounds with soldiers paid in food to protect, and shock collars on security troops so they won't turn against you, and keeping down the peasants, and very sort of Mad Max kind of scenarios. And I think that there's a degree to which the supposed wall that the Republicans keep saying they want is in the same vein, where it's not that much of a stretch to just sort of see a field of bones around the southern desert, the southern border, what is now the southern border of the United States, where the policy is to just, continue pillaging the world. And as people try to flee to areas that aren't currently being looted, let the world take care of them. And it could get a little bit grim. Other thoughts on how people will respond to each other in possibly scary ways?
Well, there's lots of fiction about that out there, and I'm just thinking of, like The Postman by David Brin, which is all about a world that basically blew itself up because of right-wing militias going crazy and shooting everything up and tearing all the institutions down. So that's a possibility. We're seeing hints of that in various places. The Mountain West has got a lot of that going on. It could happen. They're a minority. I don't know. They're a well-armed minority, but do they stand a chance?
I think it's easier to cause things to collapse than it is to maintain and build new things. Like there's a degree to which the attack on 9/11, 2001 was a very small number of people that triggered a a fairly predictable response in terms of human behavior that has had cascading effects. Because there are predictable patterns of behavior, and people respond to danger and threats by becoming more authoritarian and seeking safety at any cost. And it doesn't take a lot to push some people in that direction.
Yeah, increasingly less and less, it seems, to push people in that direction, I think. Yeah, I mean, you know, that sort of future that you're describing puts me in mind of, I mean, in many ways, the kind of Mad Max scenario, but also in some ways, the kind of, many of the kind of through lines of sort of zombie stories, right? These stories where kind of societal order and rule breaks down, and you know, we see kind of visions of a kind of like, you know, violent, nobody can be trusted, everyone for themselves, you know. In some ways it kind of reminds me of like this moment in you know, in our sort of current pandemic. You know, I was talking before we got started, I've got a 3, almost 4-year-old daughter, and there was talk right when the pandemic started about people podding up, right? Sort of forming little pod families and trying to find little sort of micro sustainable units, right? The sense that like, well, okay, we're not going to send the kids to school, so I'll teach English and you teach math and you can do science, and somebody needs to be in charge of this. And this kind of, it felt like a kind of like a little homesteady sort of vibe, right? Like we've got everything we need right here and we don't have to leave our bubble. And I think more and more people are sort of thinking in those directions, right? The talk of tiny houses and talk of going off grid, you know, the very wealthy talking about sort of their, you know, much sort of loaded up bunkers and things like this sense that like, what you really need is to kind of, you know, sort of hole up and sort of look after your own, because at a certain point, there's this sense that the sort of larger structure we're in is going to fall. And then what do we have, right? And so you can be somebody sort of roving about like, you know, characters in Cormac McCarthy's The Road, or you can be somebody who sort of, you know, thought ahead, and you've got your, you know, your little sort of tiny house off the grid in the middle of, you know, I don't know, wherever. And, you know, you've got just enough of your protein pills to make, I don't know, whatever, you know, whatever it is, right?
I think you're exactly right. And I've been writing about the need for kind of ground level organization similar to mutual aid networks, both in response to climate change and as a way to sort of build collective political power through just the power of people having sort of the common interest and having connections to each other.
Yeah.
In a way that's kind of difficult to form these days, not even before the pandemic. And I've had people reach out to me to talk about organizing and stuff, which it's not something I know a lot about, honestly. But it's been interesting because it's a mix of people who have a sort of my vision of interconnected networks. So one sort of super network globally, but made up of, you know, local cells, so to speak. But there have also been people, I think, informed by things like the fiction you're talking about, by video games, who are looking at sort of pulling together, like, what are the skills we need to have a group of people capable of surviving if everything goes south? And, you know, how do we sort of build a I don't know, a team almost that can hold out? And I mean, I don't know what to add. I think it's an old impulse in a lot of ways, but given sort of new language and new perspective, since it's been so long since we've really, like, especially in the United States, places like that, where you've really had to sort of view the world as something to fight against. It's sort of something we've risen above in some ways, and that's no longer available to us. And there are some people who are just like eager for the chaos, and you know, it's a little bit like the sort of, I guess you could say, doomsday Christian sects that are super excited for the end of days. There's a version of that that's a lot more secular in nature, where it's just, you know, I don't know, it's this sort of bizarre libertarian fantasy of just might makes right, and I'm going to be the mightiest, so I'll be the rightiest.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's, I think more and more we have generations who are kind of raised on these sort of dystopian novels where kind of, or dystopian stories in general, where sort of the strongest team rises to the fore, or, the sort of wiliest group. And so, I think, my brother, one of my brothers, when he was younger, played a lot of kind of like first-person shooter video games, and not surprisingly wanted to be a Navy SEAL. And I don't think he particularly knew much about the Navy SEALs, but he had played a version of one in one video game a lot. And so I think he sort of, this was a kind of clear narrative that he could follow in life. And it was, if you asked him about it, he would sort of happily talk about like how difficult and potentially violent and soul crushing such a job would be. But I think because it was so clearly laid out as a narrative that could be won, it was something he was interested in, right? I think part of the real challenge with climate change is, I don't know if any of you saw this talk from three storytellers. It was Amitav Ghosh, Elizabeth Colbert, and Scott Burns, I think is his name, the guy who directed Contagion. They had a kind of roundtable to talk about climate change. And one of the really interesting things that was brought up is that it's really hard to make a story out of climate change because it's not done yet, right? We're still in the middle of it. And in some ways, we're still kind of at the beginning of it. And they were talking about how movies and novels had been used to kind of shape characterizations of things like the Vietnam War or the Cold War or whatever. But the value of those things is that like, you can make those stories once the events are done, and you can sort of put an end cap on them. And the tricky thing about climate change is, we're still in it, and more, HJ, you were talking about sort of computer modeling earlier, and more, I think it's interesting when we hear these stories about like, this was projected to be where we were at today, and yet we're far beyond that, or we've sort of exceeded what the computer models thought we would be, and so I think there's this real sense that like, not only are we in the middle of this thing, but we have no real sense of the kind of flapping end that's out there in the distance, how long it is and how bad it is. And so how do we tell a story about that? And how can we tell a story that we can see ourselves sort of winning? And so we go to the sort of easiest, lowest hanging fruit, which is these kind of dystopian, chaotic, everybody for themselves narratives, which I think are particularly sort of apropos in the sense that, there's a way to look at climate change and say like, we are the bad guys, right? We're the enemies here, right? Like we're the ones who have done this. And especially if you're in a more Western country, or, you're in a much more developed place, like probably even more so, you're the one who has done this. And so I think it's particularly sort of mind-boggling when we think like, okay, we kind of have this narrative framework for it, except we're the bad guys in this scenario. And so what do we do now?
It's also really hard to write a video game in which the player is the heroic individual who fights against climate change.
Yeah.
That's not how it's going to be solved.
Yeah.
There isn't a weapon you will find to shoot climate change. So the easy resolution is out for you.
Yeah.
Well, they were talking about nuking hurricanes.
They, meaning who? I mean,
Republicans, I think.
Yes.
Of course they were.
My favorite. So I still play quite a lot of computer games, and one of my favorite first-person shooters is Fallout 4, which has various Fallout fans will tell you that it is not the best Fallout game in a lot of ways, but it's my favorite. I've only played a couple, but one of the key elements in it is that you can build settlements and attract settlers and help them protect their settlements and plant crops. And so one of the ways you can win is by basically this faction that is basically building one little homestead at a time with trade networks between them and a sort of mutual defensive agreement against the sort of various, brigands and pseudo-fascist groups and all of that. And so it's a way to it's a first-person shooter, and you do have to go around and, do the best shooting in shoot matches with other shoot people, but you can actually like take the time to build things. And of course it's very, you select an item from a menu and click it and then it appears. Like, okay. But it's a different perspective on that kind of thing, which I really very much enjoyed. Looking to the far future, since you mentioned that, it seems like a good enough segue. There was a bit of research going around, I want to say from like 2011, maybe 2015, I don't know. It was a little while back. And time no longer has any meaning for me. Basically saying that the last time CO2 levels were this high was about 15 million years ago, at which point sea levels, so CO2 levels were about this high 15 million years ago, sea levels were about 100 meters higher than they are today. So something like 300 feet. So you can, there are maps where you can play around with that. The scenario, the science fiction scenario I've been working on has something like 100, 150 feet of sea level rise. And so that has, a port city in Terre Haute, Indiana, as that's now part of the southern coast, with sort of a bay of water going up from the south. And it's sort of difficult to tell, like, normally I would assume the Midwest is going to become a desert, but of course, if you have a bay going up into the middle of it and a lot of heat and humidity, it might get a fair amount of rain. But it is going to be a radically different world. And, we are on a trajectory towards conditions unlike anything recognizable as a monkey really has ever encountered in a lot of ways. It doesn't seem likely that at this point it's necessarily, without dramatic action by us, going to stop at the 15 million years ago point.
Yeah.
Because CO2 levels are still rising. And as I recently posted, there's now clear evidence of deep water warming in the southern Atlantic, which means we're likely to start seeing a lot more methane come out of the ocean as ice deposits get destabilized, which is going to cause a lot more warming. And so we're headed for something quite unlike humanity has ever encountered before. And I guess you could say I'm stubborn in my belief that we have the means to build a society that can survive in that. But one of the things that I learned studying population ecology is that while you could have little pockets that are isolated from each other with, tough guys who can survive and, have their own little brutal fiefdoms, it doesn't take much of an event to wipe out one of those.
Right.
The crops fail for 2 years in a row. There's a big storm. The local plants get a little too poisonous. Interestingly, a number of plants use carbon dioxide as one of the main ingredients in their poisons. So poison ivy, for example, has apparently been getting a bit more toxic as CO2 levels have risen. A few thousand years in the future, that trend could get to some pretty interesting places where, you don't just get a rash anymore. Maybe you get something a little worse. And so in that scenario, it seems unlikely to me that humanity can survive unless we are connected and working together.
Yeah.
Because the scale of the problem seems a little bit too big for any, small group of obnoxious survivors with guns that are no longer particularly useful because you can't manufacture the bullets anymore.
And you don't have anything to eat. That's another problem. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I helped run a competition with like teenagers a while back, sort of trying to have them innovate solutions. It's called Innovate to Mitigate, looking for ways to reduce CO2 emissions. And one of them had the idea of cockroach farming. And there's a small company in the US that, I forget what they're called, but they make what they call chirps, which are corn chips made with a large portion of cricket flour made out of dried ground crickets. And they have chocolate chirp cookies. They sent me a free sampler of their chirps and their cookies and whatnot a while back. They're quite good. And they're much higher in protein than average because they're partly ground up crickets. And there's, there are people in, I want to say mostly Western Europe, who are working on algae farms and bacterial, well, not farms, but like an algae processing plant, where basically you grow algae in salt water, which, we're not going to run out of anytime soon, and light, and you can just grow a massive amount of it indoors, so you don't have to worry about changing weather conditions very much, and it's fairly high protein. And they turn it into, like, you can turn it into like a flour kind of thing. You can make bricks of it and stuff. And there's a group that's also doing a similar thing with the bacterial culture. We may be moving honestly more in the direction of what we would now consider processed foods, because these are things that we can grow in vats in vast quantities, even if the weather doesn't really hold out. I guess that's I don't know. It's a little scary because it sounds like very boring eating, but I'm sure we can find ways to make it interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if we bring back the Middle Sea that filled the interior of the North America during the Mesozoic, there's a number of benefits there, because Morris will finally have beachfront property.
Finally.
Finally. And we'll just go fishing for squid, right? Calamari. That's good stuff.
Well, that's another thing that's a little worrisome. It kind of seems like we're on track to not being able to get food out of the sea for much longer.
Yes, that's true.
Hopefully cephalopods will survive, just because, they're pretty neat. It may be that I think within our lifetimes, the I don't remember if it's like 15-20% or something of people's protein intake globally comes from the oceans, maybe a little less, but a sizable amount. For some people, it's much more than that. Climate change is already hammering fish populations in a number of ways. Bigger fish have trouble with warmer water because of lower oxygen levels. They suffocate, or they have to leave. There's big sections in the middle of the Atlantic now that no longer have swordfish, because swordfish can't hack it there. The water's too thin, I guess, or thick, whatever, however you want to describe it. I think food's going to become a much bigger problem for all people keep focusing on sea level rise. I think food is going to be where it really starts causing a collapse.
Well, that leads to the other solution, which is a big die-off of humanity. That will fix a lot of problems.
I feel like it's not so much a solution as the result of not having any solutions.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and it's the solution we'd rather avoid, but at the rate we're going, we're making it inevitable, I think.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting way in which I think this talk about sort of big future systemic problems is sometimes met with dread and sometimes met with a kind of maneuvering within the patterns of thought and sort of available technology that we have, right? The sort of, well, if we can't get our food here, is there a way that we could get it here, right? So we have a colleague whose son was out in Seattle, I think, Washington, somewhere in Washington, and his sort of final senior project for his university was to sort of start up a kind of like mealworm business. This is Athena and Arna's son Otto, and he was sort of trying to think through, like, could this be an actual sort of viable source of food, of protein? Are there recipes that we can come up with? Is there a sustainable way to sort of raise these things and give them out, etc.? What are the major sort of psychological barriers that people will have in eating a meal prepared with these sorts of things? And so I think there are people who respond and say, like, well, what do we have at hand that we can kind of sort of maneuver around, right? If this is a Rubik's Cube, how can I spin it around to think of it differently given what I've got? But then there's also this kind of pie in the sky thing that happens, I think, a lot in sci-fi and fantasy, where we talk about the techno fix, right? Some genius somewhere, some brilliant kid in, South Korea is going to come up with the solution that, right? Some bit of technology that that nobody's thought of. And I think there's this sense that like solutions will come from there, right? So I'm thinking of there was a story in the New Yorker, I don't know, years ago, I think by now, about Miami and Miami Beach and that sort of area, which, is soon to be completely underwater. And I think the mayor of Miami Beach was this guy who was saying, look, we've got, he like held up his cell phone, his iPhone, and he said, look, we've got these things. And 30 years ago, nobody could have predicted this, right? Although, of course, you read some science fiction, and of course people did predict precisely that, right? But, he's saying, look, nobody could have predicted that we would have come up with such brilliance. Give us 30 more years and who knows what we'll have, right? And this is the kind of, like shot in the dark, throwing your dart blindfolded, whatever, where we think more people it gives us a slightly better chance at somebody coming up with something brilliant. Which I think is a broken idea in lots of ways, right? It pushes against this notion that you're talking about, Abe, about sort of community and reliance on each other, right? It's the sort of chosen one story told all over again. But I think there is a group of people who sort of look around at a world that they don't really understand and say, look, scientists do all sorts of crazy shit all the time. Somebody will come up with something, right? Those scientists know, right? I'll just recycle a little bit. I'll cut back on meat on Fridays or whatever it is, and that'll be fine, right? And so that I think even as the world starts to look more and more strange to people, I think there's a growing sort of ideology that says, the strangeness is something that I don't understand, but other people do. And one of those brilliant, PZ over there, one of these brilliant scientists is going to come up with something, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what I can do with spiders to cure this, but no, I just don't see it. We'll need somebody more brilliant than me.
I've literally talked to people who think that Elon Musk is going to save us all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, it's of course complete nonsense in lots of ways, right? And I can't help but think of the like the deeply sort of colonialist undertones, not even undertones. I mean, it's just right there in the surface about space exploration, right? The really kind of gnarly ideas of white guys sort of going off to colonize another rich and fertile land, right? And so I think a lot about like, people place their emphasis on some technology change, right? Elon Musk is going to reveal, his whatever the thing is, or Jeff Bezos is going to, and I think about the fact that like those people, may jet off to the moon or Mars or whatever, but they are in fact going to be bringing the problem with them, which is maybe good for the rest of us here on Earth, but there's the sense of like some tech will change us. But none of our behavior needs to change, right? Tech will kind of supplement the behavior that we've got. And
I will say that if we do, like, even if they leave with whatever tiny fractional minority of people can go with them, because obviously it's not going to be anywhere near like even a tenth of the population. But also the changes will keep happening here, the trajectory we're on. And I think we've reached a point where even if we stopped all of our emissions today, it'd keep warming on the strength of what's already in the atmosphere for another 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And at that point, there are numerous natural sources of carbon that would be rotting and gassing off. The geological record indicates that warming events like this, even ones that are much, much more gradual, cause mass death. And so for all, I know that there are people who sort of, humanity is the virus and, we need to just remove all humans and stuff like that. This sort of a combination between doomerism and eco-fascism. The reality is that at this point, I think that if we don't get a handle on it, it could be that most of the things that we recognize as sort of interesting life forms could die off. Like, it could be the end of vertebrates, hypothetically. Like that's the kind of scale that we could see. It seems unlikely. Like, I'm sure there'd be fish in certain pockets of ocean where it's shallow enough and like that. But I mean, it's not clear to how bad this can get with or without our participation at this point in time. And of course, we're still here. We're not going anywhere. Even if we all dropped dead, we'd emit a lot of gases just by rotting. And but we're gonna, we are going to keep trying to survive because that's what we do. And I'm sure there will be some people who try to stop that and try to, end humanity. But I don't think they're going to succeed as well as the sort of the mass effort of humanity in sort of not dealing with the problem and just sort of accelerating, the extinction of our own food sources will.
To return to Josh's point, though, that, this idea that we're not going to cure everything with, one genius's flash of insight. I keep thinking of how we've been approaching cancer, for instance. And in cancer, there is no magic bullet. For a long time, people would think, oh, there will be this
is not one thing.
Yeah, that there will be this one treatment that poof, everything is fixed and we're all okay. And we never have to worry about cancer again. But the lesson of cancer is that no, there isn't. That what has been working is that we build up this institutional memory, these structures that we use to treat it incrementally, and those incremental treatments get better and better, so we get better and better survival, but it's not like there's a radical poof, we fixed it. But the thing is, those same institutions are fragile, and if they start to break down, then it's like our treatments go away. The cure is not something sitting in a vial somewhere. The cure is all these people and these groups working together to maintain a medical system that keeps us alive. And we're already seeing signs where that's a problem, with the current pandemic.
Yep.
People are, hospitals are overstressed. And when we start to lose that functionality for things like treating COVID-19, we're also going to start weakening our response to things like cancer and pneumonia and all these other things that we've gotten used to thinking, well, we've got ways of dealing with this. Yeah. And I think that's true if we have a climate change problem as well. All we've got right now is we keep putting patches on it.
Yeah.
We work incrementally to improve our response,
The
more
Futurama
recycling.
situation.
Yeah, it's like Josh mentioned. Yeah, I'll just eat less meat. I'll just recycle more, and that all falls apart if we reach a certain breaking point, and then all that work goes away.
Right.
Well, and I think increasingly, which has been really nice to see, the movement to have some kind of action on climate change has been focused on the systemic problem rather than individual action.
Yeah.
And the fact that the individual action thing, even to the degree that it was sort of done, it was well-meaning, it may have been, but it also was a distraction.
Yes.
It was, and it's never really been an option. Now, I will say that I feel like we've gotten a little bit off topic because this seems to be a fairly optimistic bunch, and we keep talking about the ways in which we can survive and make things better.
Hey, I brought up the fact that we can
so
all die.
I wanted to, well, yes, and I've talked to a few people who have the attitude of, if we don't get stuff done within the next 10 years, like there are some people who take the 10 years and then we're screwed limit seriously. And I think there's a degree to which that's true. 10 years and I think it's already too late for life as we know it to continue. Life is going to have to change dramatically no matter what we do. But there are some people, when we get to a certain point, who are going to think, well, At this point, the best thing I can do with my time is make sure the fuckers who got us here pay.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that A, I very much sympathize with, and B, wouldn't necessarily help the general effort. However, I have occasionally toyed with the notion of finding some area that's turning into a kind of, bleak, foul desert and building a monument to, the kinds of greed and stupidity that got us into this mess.
Mm-hmm.
Some kind of thing designed to have a stagnant, festering pool, sort of a giant pit trap that would always have rotting material in the bottom and, some names out in the middle and, a little plaque so that people who get close enough to the stinking mess would be able to read why it's there.
Yeah, but let me just disagree with you a little bit. I think there is some virtue into going after the bastards, right? Because look
For the sake of stopping them, yes.
Yes, that if you look at the problems of climate change right now, it's not the individuals who are directly contributing to it that are the big problem. It's the corporations, and which is partly fueled by the individuals who keep buying the big screen TVs and demanding a new car every year. But there are people in high positions who we can identify because they got great big mansions and they spend lots of money on buying senators, and those people we could go after them.
Well, and I think that insofar as justice has a punitive element, there's a list of people who are ripe for that. Particularly because not just because, like, you could make the argument that, I don't know, some rich person didn't, actively do harm, but they also didn't do what they could have done given their resources. Like, I don't know, Kim Kardashian wasting her money going off to a private island or something like that. Like, it's not that she has played a major role in getting us to this position. It's that she had the power to do something more than most of us and didn't. On the other hand, there are those who had usually more power than someone like her and her family, who not only didn't help, but have spent a huge amount of money preventing action.
Yes.
And lying to people.
Yes.
And, buying up and like the electric car industry could have been further ahead of where it is right now.
So much.
But,
yeah.
And there's a long list of things where, like, there are people who saw what the situation was, had people that in their employ say, like Exxon famously now, I hope it ought to be famous. If you haven't looked this up, look it up, all you listening people. They knew in the 1970s that humanity was causing climate change, that it was going to be a huge and ever-growing problem for us, and that Exxon's product was at the center of it.
Yeah.
And they chose to bury that and to spend money on propagandists telling people that it wasn't real. And that's something we're still fighting today. And they're still spending money on it today. And I would get great satisfaction. Like, it's one of those things where, like, I'm not as bloody minded as some folks who focus on this sort of thing. I don't particularly feel a need to see these people, like, drawn and quartered, but I do want to see them lose any power they have over the world at all. They can have food, they can have housing, they can have a place to sleep and, medical treatment, but the resources they're currently using to kill us all need to be used differently. And, there's a need for that stuff. We've got work to do.
Yeah, but if I may make an addendum to what I was saying, that it's not enough for us to knock people off their pedestals. We also have to change the system.
Yes.
Because otherwise, other people will just move into the positions vacated by the billionaires and start gathering their own billions and doing the same thing all over again.
Socialism or barbarism.
Yeah.
Well, and so that's why I'm sorry, I'm constitutionally incapable of not doing this. I must make a plug again. You can folks can look at, well, so I keep an eye on my blog. I post things periodically about organizing. There's a YouTube channel called Beau of the Fifth Column, which is a gentleman out of Florida who does very good work on discussing how to organize. There's a woman who runs a YouTube channel called, I think, Working Stiff USA, who also talks on similar things. I'm working on a piece to feature her work. But start forming connections with people, not about climate change specifically, although you can join the Transition Town movement, look up Transition Town Network, that'll get you where you need to go. But more importantly, just you live in a neighborhood, maybe put up a flyer saying, hey, does anybody want to help make this neighborhood a little better? And people who come will be civic-minded. And it can be small stuff like, there's a lot of trash around here. Let's do a little litter pickup. Or, you know, there's a hiking trail nearby that's gotten real overgrown. Let's just clear it out. Just little things at first. And then say, hey, you know, I know how to do a little first aid. Maybe we should do a little skill share. I can teach what I know. Does anybody want to learn how to light a fire without matches? Does anybody want to learn, you know, some of the basics of building houses? How do you grow food? How do you grow weed? Whatever it might be. How do you make alcohol as a way to clean water? And make a group, make connections not formed on a political ideology, not formed on just dealing with climate change, but formed on using collective efforts to make human life better and a little more enjoyable and a little more comfortable. And by making those connections, you're no longer as atomized as you might be now. And you have people you can call on if something bad happens, if there's a hurricane, if there's a drought, if somebody gets injured and needs help feeding themselves. Now there's people to call on who know you and know that your goal in life is making everybody's lives better. Then maybe the road needs repairing. And I don't know, maybe there's an ordinance that says you can't repair the road. Well, you get a bunch of people together and you go to the town council and say, hey, we want to repair this road. Why don't you let us? Or give us some stuff to do. And now you have some collective power that you can bring to bear. And now you can work together with people who you don't know right now. Not because you said, hey, let's build collective power to take down the man, but because you met at where you're at, which is you're all, well, okay, so maybe don't put it this way because there's some people who take offense, but we're all just monkeys who need shelter and food and companionship. And so we work together to find shelter and food and companionship and to make sure that everybody's got what they need. And that puts us on the same team automatically. It's not foolproof, but it's something anybody can do starting right now, you know, with masks, I guess. Take the pandemic into account. But look into that level of organizing, because that's going to be big if, you know, we start running out of food. Knowing the people next door who look kind of hungry is going to make them a little less scary. Them knowing you is going to make you look a little less scary if it comes to sharing. And having this network and joining up with other networks nearby you means maybe you know that, you know, there's some people down the way who've got a surplus that they're willing to share in exchange for, I don't know, medical supplies. And that can be a foundation for gradually making the current power structures of our world somewhat irrelevant to our day-to-day lives, so that we can kind of build up around them and take over in that way. It can help with survival. It can also help, I think, probably, if we do get to that point where people are trying to wage some kind of war for various political reasons, or say there's a fascist government that takes over in some crazy future. Those kinds of connections can turn into, it's very versatile, it can turn into other things. And of course, everybody can become zombies together because, you know, climate change is scary.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's getting optimistic again. We're getting hopeful and purposeful. And, well, one of the things I was thinking about is I think it seems to me that right now is a particularly good time to do this. I think one of the things that the pandemic has sort of revealed for a lot of people, of course, not everybody, right? There are certain amounts of kind of socioeconomic privilege, of course, that can exempt people from this or allow them to miss it. But I think it's revealed the way in which many of us are really sort of dependent on each other and the way in which we can impact each other. And so, just the idea of masks being a thing that we talk about as primarily protecting other people and secondarily protecting you, I think is a real sort of, it's both quite revealing when people choose to or not to wear masks, but I think it also tells us a lot about like how deeply connected and dependent upon each other we are, right? And so I think there's already this kind of growing sense, I hope, or sort of growing awakening to this notion that we're far more reliant on each other, or we can be, and perhaps should be. But also, I think I'm thinking about the really sort of major civil rights stuff that happened in America this summer and still now, right? And thinking about when like the protests were happening, for instance, all around, but in Minnesota, I had friends in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul who talked a lot about their communities, right? So not the city, but my neighborhood, right? My neighborhood is putting together a group of people to check on every single person. My neighborhood is putting together a group of people to clean up after protests every single night, right? This sense of like, it is a moment where I think a lot of people are beginning to realize and value more and more the kind of community and sort of neighborhood and sort of connections around them. And so I think this, not to be too hopeful again, but this is, I think, a really great time to start doing exactly what you're talking about, it seems to me.
Well, and I can turn us in a more bleak direction.
Yeah, we need that.
Speaking, it's important.
I've been way too hopeful recently. I mean, everything's just so fantastic, and I feel optimistic about everything. So I need to be brought down.
Yeah, no, it's. Yeah. Well, so it's been kind of a century since the last pandemic like this, and I mean, it's a bit of like. The HIV epidemic is ongoing, and like I think it's worth just mentioning that and the degree to which, as with what's happening in the U.S. and in the UK right now, there's a very large degree to which it's kind of man-made, the severity of it. However, all of the evidence that I've been able to find, all of the research, all of the discussions from epidemiologists, is that it will not be 100 years till the next one. It might not even be a full decade.
Yeah.
Because of environmental degradation. Yeah. Not just climate change, but also deforestation. Humanity is pushing into areas that we haven't really spent a lot of time in. And animals are leaving areas that humans haven't spent a lot of time in. And it's bringing people into contact with animals that we haven't been in contact with before, or rather populations of animals. It might not be like new species, but there are populations that carry diseases that have never encountered such a thing as a human before. So the next disease that's completely new to us is going to come fairly soon, because that trend is continuing. I believe the current assumed sort of mode of transmission was from like a pangolin possibly that got eaten, that had caught it from a bat. So it was not that somebody ate a bat. Just I think it's, I don't know, I find it helpful to think of this disease as an invasive species. And when you put an invasive species in a new habitat, like a human body, it pokes around to see what it can do, where it can survive, what its niche is. So now we have this thing that is doing organ damage, nerve damage, cardiovascular damage. We've got athletes with heart problems for the rest of their lives, possibly. Brain damage. And the next one's going to happen soon, compared to this gap anyway. So a smart society that pays attention to science is going to make changes that last beyond this pandemic. Whatever resolution this disease has, masks are not going to go away. Social distancing is not
Right.
going to go away. Or a lot of people are going to die again.
Yeah.
Malthusian ideas have not gone away. There are certain people with a lot of power who think that it's good for a lot of people, particularly poor people, to die.
Yeah.
They've always used disease, famine, things like that. Malthus suggested using disease and famine to control, the poors. And I think that that's going to be the biggest danger in the next couple decades, is the impulse of those in power to solve the problem by, making there be fewer people to complain about how they can't eat when, you're busy making gold-plated bagels or whatever.
Yeah, one of the things that this is going to seem like a real sort of leap away, but just sort of follow me for a second. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about a genre of writing that we don't often talk much about in sort of serious ways, which is fantasy. One of the things that I think is really interesting about fantasy is that for a long time, fantasy, the kind of narrative arc that was followed would be a sort of, the land is sort of peaceful and quiet and everything is great, and there comes a threat to the land, and so the heroes rise up and they fight the threat and they return the land to sort of peace and quiet, right? And there's this sense of kind of, we defeat things as they rise up and we vanquish them, and then happiness can reign again. But I think one of the things that has been happening recently, and not coincidentally, of course, as more and more authors of color and queer authors and women authors are writing, in trans authors, non-binary authors, are writing in this spaces, this sense that like the kinds of stories that they're telling are not about a sort of return to normalcy, but the real evil is the system itself, right? So we don't just sort of cut off the evil king's head and then we go back to when things were great, because what they're saying is like, things were never great for me, right? And so the real evil that we have to fight is this sort of bigger system that continually spits out evil kings every 10 years, as it were, right? And so I think one of the really exciting things is not just sort of hearing these new voices, but also a sort of realization of like, this is like this genre, I think, can encourage people to sort of think in bigger systemic ways, in bigger structural ways about evil and iniquity and problem, etc., in ways that I think are really valuable for the sorts of stuff that we're talking about. So it's not just, great, we beat COVID, fantastic, let's go back to exactly what we were doing, but there's a sense that like, we beat this thing and we also progress in some way, which I think we have to do, right? My wife is a biologist, and she's an immunologist, but she teaches a class on infectious disease. And one of the things that she was saying is precisely what you're talking about, which is like, this is not going to be this generation's only fight, right? This is not going to be a thing that we look back on in 50 years and say, man, I'm sure glad we beat it and solved, saved the day. There's going to be another thing that comes soon. So, yeah.
No, it's very much the fact that with everything going on right now, with climate change, with the rise of fascism, with the fight for racial equality and a better justice system, with the pandemic. What?
Poland right now.
What's going on in Poland right now? But like with everything that's going on, this is all happening because of the way things were. Like, going back to the way things were means that this will happen again and again and again. And going back to the way things were is hiding the zombie bite.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That is a nice way of thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah, there's a sort of more rotten core that we need to get to really sort of fix the problem. Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, let's see. We've been talking for almost an hour and a half now.
Oh.
Getting there. Do we have any other thoughts? Do we want to, I don't know, try to imagine ghost stories of the future about vast graveyards of people who starved to death in, I don't know, Kentucky?
Hey, Minnesota's a little closer to home, but sure, yeah.
I was just picking a place. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
first time. And then,
Oh, this will probably get cut. I don't know. People listening, you should donate. Give us money.
Oh yeah, it's a fundraiser. I forgot about that. That's why we were talking about all that pessimistic stuff, is to get people excited about supporting some blog network
That's right.
somewhere.
Yeah, donations out of fear are way up this year.
Oh, right. Yeah, we got to figure out a way to tap into that. And we should give Josh a chance to plug his book one more time.
Yeah, do so.
Yeah. My book, The Forever Sea, is coming out in the UK from Titan and in the US from DAW on January 19th. So if you're in the United States, you can maybe celebrate Donald Trump finally being out of office by buying my book. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Yep.
And you can pre-order it right now.
You pre-order it right now. Yep. You can pre-order it from anywhere. I would encourage you to buy it from anywhere other than Amazon. Yeah. Although if you do buy it anywhere, Amazon reviews do help. So don't buy it from them, but you can leave a review up there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And thanks for having me on. This was really fun.
Yeah. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right. Thank you all for listening and participating, and take care of yourselves.
Okay. We say good night to everybody.
Right.
Good night.
Oh, good night.
All right.